Hello, this is John T. Rhapsodies Esquire, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories, bringing you another Sut Lovingood story from 1867 by George W. Harris called A Razor Grinder in a Thunderstorm. George Harris walked the earth, or as Sut would say, the yeath, from 1814 to 1869, mostly in East Tennessee. In 1867, Harris published a book titled Sut Lovingood, Yarns Spun By Natural Born Durn'd Fool, containing 24 stories involving his crazy-like-a-fox rural Appalachian character, Sut Lovingood, who was based on a friend Harris made while surveying copper mines named William Sut Miller. In a departure from this channel's norm, what questions do you think arise from the following story? Hear the words of old. A Razor Grinder in a Thunderstorm, from 1867, by George W. Harris. From them awful faces you's a-makin', and that there scrap of looking-glass mirror, you wants to scare your reflection, or you's trying to shave. Which is it, George? Asked Sut. Neither, said I. Well, perhaps somebody's been a-cutting shoestrings out of a sandy deerskin with your razor, and it ain't sharp enough with all that splotchy hair on your face. You want your razor ground sharp, don't you? Well, Bake Boyd's the man that could have done it. Who was Bake Boyd? I asked. He were a mighty mean Yankee razor grinder what once come to Knoxville a while back, with a machine strapped onto his shoulders like unto a patent corn sheller, and he narrated it about that he could grind razors, scissors, or needles monstrous cheap. Bake soon got to grinding away first rate. He were a powerful, slow-speaking, dignified sort of varmint, and thought that hisself and the machine commanded the respect and submission of the population wherever he went. Course, that idea was chased out of his skull through his ears, though, monstrous quick, at Knoxville. Old Bake couldn't have come to a better place than Knoxville were in them days, for sweeping out the inside of fellers' skulls clean of all old, rusty, cobweb, bigoted ideas, and then a filling it up fresh with something new and active. And in the assortment were always one king idea for sure, and it were in the words sort of like, if I gets away from Knoxville alive, darn if I ever come here again. I spect nigh unto 1,000 fellers, off and on, come to that old town suffering powerful with an attack of a swelled head, and every darn one of them left there with the words I spoke just now, a-draping off their limber underlips, sort of like an old heartbroken horse slobbers. Well, Bake Boyd, Bake were the short for Bacon, and Bacon was his nickname, you know, were nigh unto as clever a fella as ever were born. There were dern little weevil in his wheat, mighty small chance of water in his whiskey, and not a drop of streaked blood in his veins. But he had a besetting sin. He were powerfully possessed with the devil. He were so chock full of it that his hair wouldn't lie still. He watched for openings to work off some kind of devilment, just as close as an old woman what were once unsanctified herself watches her daughters when a circus or a camp meeting was in heat. Well, one day Bake thought he seed an opening in using that there razor grinding establishment, so he set in to make his darn fool self believe that lecturing onto the science of razor sharpening were his special gift, and that right there in Knoxville were the place to try that sock on. Bake dwelt long onto the crop of dimes to be gathered from that field, that he'd make more than there were spots on the 40 fawns in July, not to speak of the big gobs of reputation he'd towed away, a-shining all over his clothes like lightning bugs onto the top of a dog fennel plant. The argument fotched him, particularly the spotted fawn part of it. But he were a Yankee and wanted to know before he began how many spots there were onto one fawn. So he went to the stable and asked old Dick, Bake's hostler, or man who takes care of horses and mules. The old man scratched his head and told him, "I've never counted 'em, but I expect there are a gallon of spots on a fawn, sure and certain." Well, Bake got some flyers printed and stuck 'em up all over town. He showed that he understood the advertisement business, for he put on the flyers a picture of a raring stud horse at the top, a strong man with a bundle on each side, and 2 barrels of marked whiskey, a wool carding machine, and a cider mill on the bottom. The old grinder were also writing out the lecture. It were a complicated sort of document. It talked sort of like a feller would to a constable to take his mind off the warrant he knowed he had for him until he seed a chance to run. It spoke in particular of the great comet of 1860, Niagara Falls, the Millennium, hatching chickens, falling from grace, and making mush out of sawdust, and generally of everything on the Almighty's green yeath, 'cept in razor grinding, and the depravity of man when he was a boy. He needed to talk about that last point, for it were boys that he was about to be dealing with, and a right tight preacher would have called them depraved, or unsanctified at the very least. Well, that night the courthouse was plumb full. Everybody were there to hear the lecture, 'ceptin' Lum Jones, and he were hid out from the Freemasons. Bake sat behind the lectern so he could read from the speech he wrote in case he forgot what was in it. What Bake didn't know was that them boys in Knoxville were set to make him look like a darn fool no matter what he said. Just out the window where Bake was standing in the courthouse was an old brass cannon full to the muzzle with powder and red clay. Upon the loft by a trap door, and plumb over Bake's head, sat Joe Jackson, a-holding on to a half-barrel full of water out of a puddle where a misfortunate dead sow had been floating for 10 days. Well, the lecture began, and promised to last till daybreak because Bake soon forgot almost everything he was going to say, so he started reading from the paper. But he read so low that no one could make out what he said, so someone whispered, "Speak louder and plainer." Bake, instead of doing better, got worse. He started reading in some foreign tongue, sort of like Cherokee with a sprinkle of Irish. It were loud enough, so far so good, but it lacked a darn sight of being plainer. The razor renovator stood with his head high and square to the congregation, his eyes taking a sight just above their heads, and a-getting rounder and bigger at every word. You could see the whites of his eyes, and he were pursing up his lips like unto a tied bag. I was listening for him to whistle next thing. Ch, ch, sort of low-like, now began to come out of the women and boys, all over the house. The old men's specs began to shine, and their mouth ends had started toward their ears. Bake began to twist, sort of like ants were surveying a railroad route up his legs. Eyes still spreading, and the infernal Cherokee getting louder, not a darn word in English, when bang went the cannon outside, lighting up all the town, smashing the windows, and shaking down the plaster. Then Joe Jackson up in the loft upset the keg, and kerslush came the nasty water onto Mr. Grinder's head, every drop of it. For a moment, Bake looked like an iron statue of a durned fool in a playing fountain. He were dressed in a linen bobtail coat and trousers, and no drawers. The water made them hug him powerful close, and made him look a heap thinner. You could see the exact length of his shirt tail, the width of the hem, and even the moles on his legs and the hair on his shins. Bake come to himself like he were used to being dunked, shook the water off himself like unto a dog, and says he, "Ladies and gentlemen, when I seed the lightning and heard the thunder, I expected a powerful rainstorm, and it is here." Here he took a smell first of one coat sleeve, and then the other, and turned up the point of his nose. "So," he continued, "owing to the inclemency of the night, I dismisses this here congregation sine die." Here he took another smell at his sleeve. "And if you hasn't been vaccinated for the yeller fever, cholery, and the black tongue, why, you'd better leave this here town, for they's all a-comin' if there's anything in the smell of this rain." "Nobody claimed back their dime," Sut said, "and Bake can't for the soul of him fix that case up to this day. Who got the best of it? The razor grinder or the other side? Sometimes he thinks one, and sometimes the other." While Sut was telling this story, a fat-headed young man listened throughout without moving a muscle of his face. When it was finished, he raised his expressionless eyes and asked, "Did anybody laugh at the unfortunate man that night, Mr. Lovingood?" Sut eyed him for a moment, from head to foot and back again, with an expression of supreme contempt, and shambling off, looked back over his shoulder and said, "You must be a durned fool." And that concludes George Harris's 1867 Sut Lovingood story called A Razor Grinder in a Thunderstorm. As asked in the introduction, what questions do you think arise from this story? Let us know in the comments section. This is John T. Rhapsodies Esquire, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories. Thank you for listening. If you like the music you heard in the introduction and throughout the story, stay tuned to hear more at the end of this video. You can find more stories like this in the channel's playlists. Find them by staying tuned for the last 20 seconds of this video and clicking on the end screen icon. You can also go to the channel homepage and click on the playlist icon. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more, please help me earn the warm embrace of Mr. and Mrs. YouTubes who look with loving favor upon those channels whose listeners faithfully subscribe, like, comment, click the notification bell, and share the videos with their friends so that they too can hear the words of old.